Hey, what's up, folks? Welcome back to part 2 of my Raspberry Pi tutorial series. In this video, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the hardware and accessories that you're going to need to get started, so stick around. Okay, so let's start out with the bare necessities. The two things you will definitely need are power and an SD card. And let me take a moment here to talk about power because it's important, and the Pi is a little picky about its power source. So, learning about what you need here for power could save you a lot of headache later down the road. The Pi needs 5 volts, and that should be anywhere between 4.75 volts and a max of 5.25 volts. At least 700 milliamps, but I would say 1,000 milliamps or more is recommended because when you start plugging in a keyboard, mouse, network cable, etc., these all pull power away from the system. So I would even say 1,500 to 2,000 milliamps would be even better. Of course, if you're only doing projects close to your desktop computer and you don't really plan to run the Pi 24/7, you could just run it off of your desktop system's power with just a USB cable if you want. When I first got my Pi, I was anxious to get it up and running quickly, so I just grabbed the nearest power adapter I could find, which happened to be my cell phone charger, and it was rated at 5 volts, 1,000 milliamps. But the system was not very stable. It would lock up constantly, and I couldn't really do anything on it. And I didn't really want to use my cell phone charger anyway, so I went and bought another adapter from my local Fry's that would supply 2,000 milliamps, and I also bought another 6-foot USB to micro USB cable. Tried that out, and it still didn't work properly. So in order to troubleshoot and test the power draw, I have an inexpensive voltmeter laying around, and you can do this too if you have a meter. Set it to DCV20. And use contacts TP1 and TP2 on your Raspberry Pi in order to test your voltage. You want to put TP1, you want to put your red post, and then your black on TP2. Depending on what I was running, the voltmeter showed it was dropping below 4.5 volts and sometimes below 4.3 volts when all of my peripherals were plugged in, which is way too low. So I plugged in another USB cable, which was running from my desktop system, and for some reason it ran fine, averaging 4.7 to 4.89 volts. But this was not the same cable. It was a different, higher quality cable that I used with my cell phone, and I later figured out that the power supply wasn't the problem. It was the cheap micro USB cable, and I'm not sure if that's because of the 6-foot length, but I would guess that it's probably losing power over that length. So at any rate, get a good cable and maybe a short 3-foot cable just to be on the safe side. Okay, moving on to storage. There is no onboard storage on the Raspberry Pi, so you need an SD card to run the OS from and also to store any files. I would recommend at least a Class 4, but get the best you can get, a Class 6 or a Class 10 if you don't mind spending a little bit more. The cost difference honestly isn't that much, and SD cards are getting cheaper all the time. The one that I got is a Class 10, and you'll need a card reader to transfer the OS image that you're going to download off of Raspberry Pi's website from your desktop computer to the SD card. And you can also buy cards with the OS pre-installed from whoever your Pi vendor is if you happen to want to skip the OS installation step. But really, it's super easy, and I'm going to go through that in another tutorial after this one. So if you want to try out multiple operating systems, you can do that with a single card, but just keep in mind you'll overwrite any of your settings that you've played around with in the OS. I actually have a couple of test cards for each OS, so it's easier to swap back and forth, and I can try out whatever I want to without having to overwrite everything. All right, let's move on to user interaction. You'll need to decide kind of how you want to interact with your Pi. You can either do it headless over a network or with a keyboard and mouse and monitor, or you can do a combination of both. For network access, you're going to need a network cable, either a Cat5, Cat5e, or Cat6 to connect to your router. I'm assuming you have a router. There's also a USB Wi-Fi option that I haven't really tried yet. But connecting to my router was super easy, and DHCP automatically gave it an IP address that I could log on to from my desktop. Then you can connect using SSH with the default username and password, and this should work for whatever OS you install, either OpenELEC or Raspbian. Yet again, I'll get into that in another tutorial after this one. USB keyboard and mouse. If you're going headless, you don't really need either of these. They're both optional. It just depends on what you want to use the Pi for. Like I said, if you don't want to use the desktop interface, you can skip using a mouse. You can just plug in a keyboard. If you're using it as a media center, navigating XBMC is also pretty easy to do with a keyboard, and there's also wireless and Bluetooth options if you want to sit on your couch and navigate your media center. If you're only planning to remote log in with SSH, you can skip the keyboard as well. Or if you want to just borrow a keyboard and mouse from another machine for the initial setup before you actually go headless over the network, Pi should automatically get an IP address, like I said, from your router. And if you're going to do that from the start, you can just log into your router to see what IP address was assigned, and then connect using SSH. If you're local, you can use ifconfig to find out what your IP address is, and then you can unplug all of your keyboard and mouse and monitor, and then just go headless from there. Okay, so moving on to displays. If your TV or your monitor has an HDMI input, that's great, because all you'll need to get is a cheap HDMI cable. And if your monitor only has DVI in, you'll need an HDMI to DVI cable or an adapter. And just keep in mind, if you do that, the sound will be ignored that's coming out of the HDMI port when you're using a DVI converter. So depending on your setup, you can either use external speakers or a splitter. And there's also RCA out to connect to older standard definition televisions. And I tried recently to run XBMC on my Pi using the RCA out, and it worked flawlessly with SD videos. Although HD videos would not down convert, and I could only hear sound, so it wouldn't play the video, but you could still hear the sound. If you're going to be headless, you can also skip purchasing, a separate monitor specifically for your Pi, and just borrow one for the initial setup if you want to. Otherwise, you can still do most of the setup across the network if you connect via SSH. I know I'm throwing around a lot of acronyms and terms right now, and if you're completely confused, don't worry. In some of the tutorials after this, I'm going to explain these a little bit more in depth. Okay, so even though it may look cool, keeping your bare board out with a bunch of wires just hanging off of it is probably not the safest thing to do for your Pi. So this is completely optional, but I would recommend getting a case. You can get a prefab case for as little as $5. Like I said, completely optional, but it does help protect the board. And a number of people have made some pretty cool custom cases, and I kind of like this clear one from Adafruit. It's a little pricey at $15, but I currently don't have a case, mainly only because I haven't decided which one I want yet. So anyway, that's about it for the initial hardware and accessories. There are a ton of other add-on boards, cables, etc., but I'm mainly just focusing on getting you up and running. So in the next tutorials, we can get into some of the good stuff, like installing the operating system and running our Pi for the first time. So thank you for watching, and be sure to check out part 3.